Blue lights flashing in your rearview mirror usually mean a simple ticket. But for Elias Hayes, a decorated combat veteran returning home, those flashing red and blue strobes sparked a nightmare. 2 rogue officers pulled him over on a dark, isolated stretch of highway, intent on teaching him a lesson he didn't deserve. Blooded, pinned against cold asphalt, Elias braced for worst. Suddenly, a booming voice ordered those officers to stand down. A captain arrived, unleashing instant, brutal karma that cost those corrupt cops everything. Listen closely, because this true-to-life tale proves justice always finds a way. The dashboard clock of the 2014 Ford F-150 read 2:14 a.m. Rain drummed a relentless, rhythmic beat against the windshield, smearing the yellow glow of the streetlights along Interstate 84. Inside the cab, 35-year-old Elias Hayes rolled his shoulders, wincing as a familiar ache radiated through his right rotator cuff, a permanent souvenir from a roadside blast in Kandahar province 8 years prior. Elias was exhausted. He had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift as a respiratory therapist at Oakwood Memorial Hospital. Before that, he had spent 6 years in the 82nd Airborne Division, deploying 3 times. He was a man who understood pressure, trauma, and the fragile line between life and death. Tonight, all he wanted was to go home to his quiet suburban house, heat up some leftover chicken, and sleep. He drove meticulously, cruising exactly at the posted speed limit of 55 miles per hour. His hands rested at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. A half-mile behind him, obscured by the heavy downpour, Oakwood Police Department Cruiser Unit 44 crept along the wet asphalt. Inside sat Officer Thomas Jenkins and his rookie partner, Officer Ryan Brody. Jenkins was a 10-year veteran of the force with a reputation that preceded him in the worst ways. Bitter over being repeatedly passed over for sergeant, Jenkins harbored deep-seated prejudices and a toxic need for control. He viewed the citizens of his precinct not as people to protect, but as subjects to dominate. Brody, barely 23 and fresh out of the academy, was entirely under Jenkins's thumb. Desperate for his training officer's approval, Brody absorbed Jenkins's worst habits like a sponge. "Look at this guy," Jenkins muttered, his eyes narrowed at the tail lights of Elias's truck. "Driving a little too perfect, don't you think? Nobody drives exactly 55 at 2 in the morning, unless they're holding something or hiding something." "You want to light him up?" Brody asked, his voice betraying a hint of nervous excitement. "License plate light is flickering," Jenkins said, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "That's all the probable cause we need. Let's see what kind of trash is rolling through our town tonight." Jenkins flipped the switch. Inside the truck, Elias's rearview mirror exploded with blinding red and blue strobes. His stomach instantly dropped. As a black man driving alone late at night, the sight of police lights triggered a specific, cold anxiety that no amount of military training could entirely erase. His pulse quickened, but his discipline immediately took over. Elias initiated the traffic stop survival protocol, a set of rigid rules his father had drilled into him since he first got his learner's permit. Pull over immediately to the safest, most well-lit area available. Turn off the engine and place the keys prominently on the dashboard. Turn on the interior dome light so the officers can see exactly what is inside the vehicle. Roll down the window completely before the officer approaches. Keep hands glued to the steering wheel at all times. Elias spotted an abandoned Chevron gas station a quarter-mile ahead. He engaged his turn signal, pulled smoothly into the concrete lot beneath the flickering canopy lights, and executed every step of his protocol flawlessly. He took a deep breath. 4 seconds in, hold for 4, 4 seconds out, centering his heart rate. In his side mirror, he watched the 2 officers step out into the rain. Jenkins unclipped the restraining strap on his holster. It was a subtle, aggressive movement, but to a combat veteran trained to read physical cues, it screamed hostility. Brody followed suit, shining a high-powered tactical flashlight directly into Elias's side mirror, blinding him. "Keep your hands right where they are," Jenkins barked as he approached the driver's side window. The tone wasn't authoritative. It was inherently combative. "Good evening, officer," Elias said, his voice calm, deep and steady. "My hands are on the wheel." "I didn't ask you what kind of evening it is, boy," Jenkins snapped, leaning in close so the smell of stale coffee and aggressive cologne wafted into the cab. The use of the word boy hung in the humid air, a deliberate, calculated insult. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "No, sir, I do not. Your license plate light is out, plus you're swerving all over the road." "I apologize if my light is malfunctioning, sir," Elias replied, choosing to ignore the blatant lie about swerving. Arguing on the side of a dark road was a losing battle. "I will have it replaced tomorrow morning. License, registration, and proof of insurance." "Now," Jenkins demanded. "Yes, sir. My wallet is in my left back pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. I am going to reach for my wallet first, slowly. Is that acceptable?" Jenkins exchanged a look with Brody, who had positioned himself slightly behind the passenger door, his hand resting anxiously on his taser. "Don't you play games with me," Jenkins growled. "Just get the damn ID." Elias slowly, deliberately moved his left hand toward his back pocket. As his fingers brushed the leather of his wallet, he shifted his weight slightly in the seat to free it. "He's moving around! He's reaching!" Brody suddenly shouted from the passenger side, his inexperience and adrenaline getting the better of him. Before Elias could even process the panic in the rookie's voice, he heard the terrifying metallic snick of Jenkins unholstering his Glock 19. "Hands! Show me your hands right now, or I will blow your head off!" Jenkins screamed, pointing the barrel of the gun directly at Elias's temple. Elias immediately froze, raising both hands slowly until they were visible, his palms open. "My hands are up. I am not a threat. I am completely unarmed." The situation had shattered. A simple traffic stop for a flickering bulb had escalated into a life-or-death confrontation in a matter of seconds, driven by a toxic mix of rookie panic and deeply rooted racial prejudice. "Get out of the car! Step out of the vehicle right now!" Jenkins roared, his face flushed red with unearned rage. The gun remained fixed on Elias's head. "I am stepping out," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping fully into the stoic, hyper-focused state that had kept him alive in firefights overseas. He knew that the slightest sudden movement, a twitch, or even a deep sigh could be interpreted as resisting. He reached down with one finger, popped the seatbelt clasp, and used his left hand to push the heavy door open. As soon as his boots touched the wet asphalt, Jenkins lunged forward. The officer grabbed the collar of Elias's jacket and violently yanked him out of the cab. Elias stumbled, but kept his footing. Before he could speak, Jenkins shoved him hard from behind. Elias collided with the steel side of his own truck bed, the impact knocking the wind out of him. The cold, wet metal pressed against his cheek. "Spread your legs," Jenkins yelled, kicking Elias's right ankle with the steel toe of his boot to force his legs apart. The kick was entirely unnecessary. Elias was already complying. "Officer, there is no need for this," Elias stated calmly. "I am a veteran. I work at the local hospital. I am just trying to get home." "Shut your mouth!" Brody yelled, rushing over to assist Jenkins. The rookie was visibly shaking, feeding off his partner's erratic energy. "Stop resisting. Stop tensing up." "I am not resisting," Elias replied. "I am completely relaxed." Jenkins grabbed Elias's left arm, wrenching it behind his back with vicious force. Then he grabbed the right arm, the one with the damaged rotator cuff. As Jenkins yanked it upward to apply the handcuffs, a sickening pop echoed in the rain. Blinding, white-hot agony shot through Elias's shoulder. It felt as though a serrated knife had been driven into his joint. A sharp gasp escaped his lips, and his body naturally flinched from the intense pain. "He's fighting back!" Jenkins shouted triumphantly, finding the exact excuse he was looking for. Using his full body weight, Jenkins tackled Elias to the ground. The veteran hit the wet concrete hard, scraping his chin and tasting the metallic tang of his own blood. Before Elias could even catch his breath, Jenkins dropped his knee directly into the center of Elias's back, pressing down with immense pressure. "You people always think you can do whatever you want," Jenkins hissed quietly, leaning down so only Elias could hear him. The racist venom in his voice was unmistakable. "You think because you got a nice truck, the rules don't apply to you? I own these streets, boy." The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around Elias's wrists, ratcheted incredibly tight, cutting off the circulation to his hands. He lay on the freezing, rain-slicked pavement, rain pouring into his eyes, his shoulder screaming in pain, and a corrupt cop's knee driving the breath from his lungs. For a fleeting second, the smell of the wet asphalt transported him back to a bombed-out road in Helmand province. He felt the familiar shadow of PTSD creeping up his spine. "No," Elias told himself. "Do not let them break your mind. Stay present. Survive the encounter." "Check his truck, Brody," Jenkins ordered, keeping his weight planted firmly on Elias. "Tear it apart. I guarantee you this thug is moving narcotics." Brody practically sprinted to the open door of the F-150. He began ripping through Elias's pristine vehicle like a ravenous dog. He threw Elias's meticulously organized paperwork onto the wet ground. He pulled out Elias's medical scrubs, tossing them into the mud. He tore apart the glove compartment, scattering insurance cards, registration, and napkins to the wind. Then, Brody reached behind the passenger seat and pulled out a beautifully crafted, velvet-lined mahogany shadow box. It contained Elias's military medals, his Purple Heart, his Bronze Star with a V for valor, and several commendation ribbons. Elias had been taking it to a specialized framer in the city the next morning to have the glass repaired. "What's this?" Brody asked, holding it up in the rain. "Look at this shiny garbage. Probably bought it at a pawn shop to get sympathy from judges." Brody carelessly tossed the shadow box onto the passenger seat, cracking the wooden frame. Elias's jaw clenched. The disrespect toward the medals that represented the blood of his fallen brothers ignited a fierce, protective anger in his chest. Yet, he remained silent. He knew that speaking up now would only invite a boot to his teeth. "Find anything?" Jenkins asked, shifting his knee higher up, resting dangerously close to Elias's neck. "Nothing yet." "No drugs, no weapons," Brody admitted, sounding almost disappointed. Jenkins scoffed. "Look harder. He's hiding something." As Brody continued to destroy the interior of the truck, Jenkins leaned his weight down further. Elias's vision began to spot with black stars. His chest was compressed. He was struggling to draw air. "Officer, please!" Elias gasped, his voice tight. "I can't breathe. My shoulder is dislocated." "If you can talk, you can breathe," Jenkins sneered, a cruel, overused cliché. "Just stay down and learn your place." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Elias was a highly trained medic. He knew the signs of positional asphyxiation. His oxygen saturation was dropping. His heart was hammering against his ribs in a desperate attempt to pump blood. He realized with terrifying clarity that Jenkins had no intention of easing up. Jenkins was enjoying this. he was exerting absolute, unchecked power over a black man on a deserted road in the middle of the night, confident that his badge would shield him from any consequences. But Jenkins was wrong. The universe has a peculiar way of balancing the scales, and on this dark, rainy night, Karma was driving a black, unmarked Ford Explorer. 2 miles away, Captain William Sterling had been cruising the perimeter of the Oakwood precinct. Sterling was a towering, broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with silver hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. As the precinct commander, it was highly unusual for him to be working a graveyard patrol shift. But Sterling was a man on a mission. Over the past 8 months, his precinct had been hit with a disturbing spike in excessive force complaints and civil rights lawsuits, specifically targeting minority drivers. After quietly pulling the data, Sterling noticed a glaring pattern. Sterling had been working secretly with internal affairs to build a watertight case against Jenkins. He knew Jenkins was a cancer in his department, a brutal racist hiding behind a piece of tin. Sterling refused to let his department be corrupted. He had been quietly tailing Unit 44 for 3 nights, waiting for them to make a mistake. When the dispatcher crackled over the radio, "Unit 44 dispatch, show us on a 1011 traffic stop, southbound OI 84 near the old Chevron," Sterling immediately whipped his Explorer around. He knew that stretch of road. It was a black hole for dash cams and radio signals. Sterling killed his headlights as he approached the gas station, rolling into the lot under the cover of darkness and heavy rain. He parked behind the blinding array of Jenkins's cruiser lights and stepped out of his vehicle. Through the pouring rain, Sterling's eyes adjusted to the scene. He saw Brody practically tearing the interior of a civilian truck to shreds. And then he saw Jenkins. Jenkins was kneeling heavily on a man who was handcuffed face down on the wet pavement. Sterling watched in disgusted silence for 10 seconds. He observed the civilian. The man wasn't moving. He wasn't resisting. He was simply enduring the crushing weight of a sadistic officer. A cold fury ignited in Captain Sterling's chest. He slammed the door of his Explorer shut, the heavy metallic thud echoing like a gunshot over the rain. Brody jumped out of the truck, visibly startled, his hand reaching for his sidearm. Jenkins whipped his head around, his eyes widening, as he recognized the imposing silhouette stepping into the halo of the cruiser's headlights. The gold oak leaves on Sterling's collar caught the light. "Captain Sterling," Jenkins stammered, immediately trying to pull his knee off Elias, but stumbling clumsily in his haste. We got a combative suspect here, sir. Resisting arrest." Sterling ignored him. He walked with heavy, deliberate, menacing steps toward the center of the scene. His booming voice cut through the storm like thunder. "Stand down! Step the hell away from him, Jenkins! Right now!" Jenkins scrambled backward, raising his hands defensively. "Captain, I swear he was reaching for his waistband. He refused lawful orders." "Shut your mouth before you make this worse for yourself," Sterling commanded, his voice deadly quiet, laced with absolute authority. Sterling approached the man on the ground. He knelt beside him, unconcerned with the mud ruining his uniform trousers. "Sir, are you all right?" Sterling asked, gently touching the man's uninjured shoulder. Elias slowly turned his head, his face bruised, blood trickling from his chin. He blinked through the rain, his vision swimming slightly. "My right shoulder. It's out of the socket. The cuffs. Too tight." Sterling looked closely at the man's face. The harsh light illuminated Elias's features. Sterling froze. The breath hitched in his throat. No, it couldn't be. But it was. Captain Sterling recognized him instantly. 3 years ago, Sterling's younger brother, a staff sergeant in the army, had been severely wounded in a mortar attack in Afghanistan. It was a combat medic who had braved heavy enemy fire, sprinted across an open compound, applied a double tourniquet, and physically carried his brother to the medevac chopper. That medic had saved his brother's life. The family had eventually met the medic at a VFW commendation ceremony. Sterling stared into the eyes of Elias Hayes. The realization of what his officers had just done to an American hero, to the man who saved his own blood, struck Captain Sterling with the force of a freight train. The simmering anger inside the captain instantly crystallized into absolute, terrifying rage. Sterling stood up slowly. He turned to face Jenkins and Brody. The two officers shrank back, suddenly realizing they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The air grew thick, the rain seemingly suspended in the intense silence between them. "Brody," Sterling said, his voice trembling with a wrath so profound it shook the young rookie to his core. "Get the keys. Take those cuffs off him. If you cause him 1 ounce of pain, I will break your arm, myself." "Yes, sir," Brody stuttered, practically sprinting over with the handcuff keys, his hands shaking violently as he unlocked the steel bracelets. Elias groaned as the pressure released, cradling his dislocated arm against his chest. Sterling knelt back down, helping Elias to sit up, shielding him from the rain with his own broad shoulders. "I've got you, Elias. I've got you, son. An ambulance is on the way." Sterling stood back up and slowly walked toward Jenkins. Jenkins tried to hold his ground, but the sheer, imposing presence of his commanding officer forced him to take a step back. "Captain, you don't understand," Jenkins tried to plead, his arrogance completely evaporating, replaced by raw panic. He was swerving. He had a tail light out. It was a good stop. "A good stop?" Sterling whispered dangerously. He gestured sharply toward Elias's ruined truck, the scattered medical paperwork, the destroyed shadow box in the front seat. "Is that what you call this, Jenkins? You pull over a decorated combat veteran, a respiratory therapist. You tear his property apart. You dislocate his shoulder, and you kneel on his spine while he is fully compliant?" "He was resisting," Jenkins lied one final desperate time. "I have been watching you for 10 minutes, Sterling roared, his voice echoing off the abandoned gas station canopy. "I saw everything. There was zero resistance. You targeted him. You assaulted him. You disgraced this uniform." Sterling extended his open hand, palm up. "Your badge, your sidearm. Hand them over, now." Jenkins stared at the captain's hand in disbelief. "Captain, you can't do this. I've got 10 years on the force. The Union—" "I said now," Sterling bellowed. "You are stripped of your police powers, effective immediately. You are a disgrace to the badge, a disgrace to this city, and a disgrace to humanity." Trembling, utterly defeated, Jenkins unclipped his radio, unholstered his weapon, and unpinned his badge. He dropped them into the captain's heavy hand. Sterling turned his piercing gaze to Brody. The young rookie was already crying, rain and tears mixing on his pale face. "You too, Brody. Hand them over." As the distant wail of ambulance sirens began to cut through the stormy night, Jenkins and Brody stood disarmed, stripped of their power, shivering in the cold rain. The instant karma had been brutal and swift, but Captain Sterling was not finished with them. The true nightmare for these corrupt officers was only just beginning. The wail of the ambulance siren cut through the relentless downpour, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that had previously choked the abandoned Chevron lot. Captain William Sterling stood perfectly still in the freezing rain, his uniform soaked through to his skin, watching the paramedics carefully load Elias Hayes into the back of the rig. Elias's face was a mask of stoic endurance, despite the heavy doses of fentanyl the medics had administered for his severely dislocated right shoulder and suspected torn labrum. As the heavy doors of the ambulance prepared to close, Sterling stepped forward, placing a massive, reassuring hand on the edge of the bumper. "Mr. Hayes," Sterling said, his voice thick with an emotion that bordered on reverence. "I will personally secure your vehicle. I will personally gather your belongings, including your commendations. And I give you my word as an officer, a man, and the brother of the soldier you saved in Kandahar. The men who did this to you will never wear a badge again. They will face the absolute maximum penalty under the law." Elias gave a slow, deliberate nod, the heavy pain medication finally beginning to glaze his eyes. "Thank you, Captain. Just make sure they can't do this to anyone else." "Count on it," Sterling vowed, stepping back as the ambulance sped off toward Oakwood Memorial, the very hospital where Elias was supposed to be resting after his grueling 14-hour shift. Back at the Oakwood Police Department, Precinct 7, the atmosphere was entirely different. Officer Thomas Jenkins, now stripped of his badge and sidearm, was pacing the dingy tiles of the locker room like a caged, rabid animal. His uniform was still damp, smelling of rain and asphalt, but his arrogance had miraculously returned the moment he stepped foot inside the familiar walls of his precinct. Beside him stood Frank Cobb, the precinct's Bulldog Union representative, a man notorious for twisting facts and burying excessive force complaints beneath mountains of bureaucratic red tape. "Sterling is out of his damn mind, Frank," Jenkins spat, slamming his fist into a grey metal locker, the resulting clang echoing through the room. "He blindsided me. He rolled up on a high-risk traffic stop, compromised my command presence, and then stripped me in the field. The suspect was combative. He refused lawful orders. He was reaching behind his back. I used standard pain compliance techniques. It's all by the book." Cobb, a heavy-set man with a perpetually loosened tie, chewed the end of a cheap pen and nodded slowly. "Relax, Tommy. Sterling's an old-school Boy Scout. He gets emotional, but he doesn't have the final say. The union contract protects you. We claim the suspect was exhibiting signs of excited delirium. We say you feared for your life because of the suspect's military background, which makes him a lethal threat, right?" "Exactly." Jenkins seized on the narrative, his eyes lighting up with malignant validation. "He was a trained killer. Brody was panicked. I had to take control of the situation to protect my rookie. Sterling has nothing but his own bleeding heart perspective." "What about the cameras?" Cobb asked, his eyes narrowing. "Body cams, dash cam." Jenkins let out a dark, confident chuckle. "Brody's body cam was blocked by the truck door. I hit the mute and stand-by sequence on mine right before I pulled the suspect out of the vehicle. Claimed a malfunction. And the cruiser's dash cam. I hit the manual kill switch on the hard drive array in the trunk right before Sterling walked up. The footage is gone, Frank. It's my word against the suspects. And in this town, a cop's word still reigns supreme." Cobb smiled, patting Jenkins on the shoulder. "Then you're golden. We'll file a grievance against Sterling by sunrise. You'll be on paid administrative leave by noon and back on patrol in a month with back pay. Sit tight." What Jenkins didn't know, what his staggering arrogance prevented him from realizing, was that the universe was already tightening a noose around his career. 3 floors up, inside the precinct's heavily soundproofed Internal Affairs Division, Captain Sterling was sitting across from Detective Sarah Lawson, the most ruthless IA investigator in the state. Lawson was a former prosecutor who had transitioned to internal affairs specifically to root out the kind of toxic corruption Jenkins represented. "I want him buried, Sarah," Sterling said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He placed Elias's shattered mahogany shadow box gently on the desk. He didn't just assault a civilian. He targeted a black man. He brutalized a decorated combat medic who saved my little brother's life. He disgraced this entire department. Lawson examined the broken glass and the mud-stained purple heart. Her jaw tightened. I pulled his jacket, Captain. Jenkins has 14 excessive force complaints this year alone. But his union rep, Cobb, always finds a loophole. The witnesses get intimidated, or the footage mysteriously corrupts. Not this time, Sterling stated, leaning forward, a predatory gleam in his silver eyes. Jenkins is old school, Sarah. He thinks he's smart. He thinks hitting the manual kill switch on his cruiser's hard drive deletes the dashcam footage. Lawson's eyes widened slightly as she caught on. The Axon Fleet 3 upgrade. Exactly, Sterling confirmed, a grim smile finally touching his lips. Just 2 weeks prior, Captain Sterling had quietly authorized a precinct-wide firmware update to the cruiser camera systems. The new Axon Fleet 3 system no longer relied solely on the physical hard drives stored in the trunks of the police cruisers, drives that corrupt officers often conveniently damaged. Instead, the system featured a redundant, real-time LTE cloud uplink. The moment the cruiser's emergency lights were activated, a high-definition, unalterable feed was beamed directly to secure servers at the state capitol. Jenkins doesn't read his internal memos, Sterling said, pulling a sleek tablet from his briefcase and sliding it across the desk to Lawson. He thinks he wiped the tape. He has no idea we have the entire incident in glorious 1080p with enhanced audio, backed up on a federal server. Lawson tapped the screen, loading the cloud database. She found Unit 44's data packet from 2:14 a.m. She pressed play. The two veterans of the force sat in disgusted silence as they watched the crystal-clear footage. They heard Elias's calm, compliant voice. They heard Jenkins's aggressive, racist taunts. They watched Jenkins deliberately kick Elias's legs, violently yank him from the truck, and intentionally snap his arm backward before driving his knee into the veteran's spine. They heard Brody destroying the interior of the truck and disrespecting the military medals. It was undeniable, horrific, and legally bulletproof. "It's worse than I thought," Lawson whispered, her face pale. "This isn't just excessive force. This is deprivation of civil rights under color of law. It's a federal felony." "I know," Sterling replied, standing up, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the IA office. "Call the FBI field office. Ask for Special Agent Robert Miller. Tell him we have a civil rights violation wrapped up with a neat little bow. And Sarah?" "Yes, Captain. Set up interrogation room A. Tell Cobb to bring his golden boy up here. Let's let Jenkins dig his own grave." At 6 a.m., the harsh, fluorescent lights of interrogation room A buzzed with an irritating hum. Jenkins sat confidently at the metal table, sipping a lukewarm coffee, his union rep, Frank Cobb, seated beside him. Jenkins looked entirely unbothered, acting as though he had been called in for a routine paperwork discrepancy rather than a career-ending felony investigation. The heavy steel door swung open. Captain Sterling walked in, his presence immediately sucking the air out of the room. He was followed closely by IA Detective Sarah Lawson, who carried a thick manila folder and a remote control. "Let's make this quick, Captain," Cobb started aggressively, leaning forward. "My client has been subjected to public humiliation, stripped of his police powers without due process, and forced to endure a hostile work environment. We are demanding immediate reinstatement and a formal apology." Sterling didn't even look at Cobb. His piercing eyes were locked dead onto Jenkins. "Officer Jenkins," Sterling began, his tone deceptively conversational. "I am giving you one final opportunity to tell me exactly what happened tonight at 2:14 a.m. on Interstate 84. Jenkins smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. Like I told you at the scene, Captain, the suspect, Elias Hayes, was swerving. He had a defective tail light. I initiated a lawful stop. When I asked for his ID, he made furtive movements toward his waistband. He became verbally combative. When I ordered him out of the vehicle, he physically resisted my control holds. He tensed his arms to prevent handcuffing. I used an approved dynamic takedown to secure him, fearing for the safety of myself and Officer Brody. That is my official statement. Furtive movements, combative, resisting, Lawson repeated, writing the words down on a legal pad with exaggerated slowness. And what about the suspect's injuries? If he got hurt, it's because he fought back, Jenkins scoffed. You play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. He should have just complied. I see, Sterling said quietly. He turned to Lawson and nodded. Play it. Lawson picked up the remote and pointed it at the large flat-screen monitor mounted on the cinder-block wall. Wait, play what? Jenkins asked, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. My body cam malfunctioned. The dash drive is... Jenkins stopped himself just in time. Corrupted? Is that what you were going to say, Thomas? Sterling asked, the venom finally bleeding into his voice. Did you forget about the Axon Fleet 3 cloud upgrade? Did you really think destroying a hard drive in the trunk would save you? The color instantly drained from Jenkins's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. The screen flickered to life. The high-definition footage began to play. Jenkins's own aggressive voice echoed through the interrogation room, demanding Elias's ID. Then came the clear visual of Elias's hands, perfectly visible on the steering wheel. The sickening pop of the shoulder dislocation. Jenkins's racist whisper. You think because you got a nice truck, the rules don't apply to you. I own these streets, boy. Cobb, the Bulldog Union rep, stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open. He slowly put his pen down, pushing his chair an inch away from Jenkins. Cobb knew a sinking ship when he saw one, and this footage was a torpedo straight to the hull. Turn it off, Jenkins croaked, his bravado entirely shattered. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. That footage is taken out of context. The angle is perfect, Special Agent Robert Miller interrupted, stepping into the room from the observation corridor. Miller flashed his FBI credentials. Thomas Jenkins, you are under arrest for deprivation of rights, under color of law, aggravated assault, and official oppression. Jenkins panicked. The realization that he was losing everything, his badge, his freedom, his power, hit him like a physical blow. He desperately scrambled for a lifeline. He pointed a trembling finger at the door. It was Brody! Jenkins shouted, completely throwing his young partner under the bus without a second thought. Brody escalated it. He yelled that the guy was reaching. I just reacted to my rookie's verbal cues. I was protecting him. You need to talk to Brody. We already did, Agent Miller said calmly. The door opened again. Officer Ryan Brody stood in the doorway, escorted by another IA detective. The rookie had stripped off his uniform and was wearing civilian clothes. He looked pale, exhausted, and utterly broken. Tell him what you told us, Ryan, Sterling commanded softly. Brody couldn't look Jenkins in the eye. He stared at the floor. I signed a proffer agreement with the district attorney and the feds. I gave them everything, Jenkins. I told them how you told me to lie on the reports. I told them how you target minorities on the night shift. I told them that tonight you deliberately snapped that man's shoulder because he didn't cower to you. I'm sorry. I couldn't go to federal prison for you. You rat! Jenkins lunged across the table toward Brody, but Agent Miller and Captain Sterling were faster. Sterling grabbed Jenkins by the collar of his shirt, slamming him brutally back into the metal chair. The physical power of the precinct commander was overwhelming. "You don't get to hurt anyone else," Sterling growled, his face inches from Jenkins's. "Put your hands behind your back." The poetic justice in the room was absolute. Jenkins, the man who had violently and unnecessarily handcuffed a compliant war hero just hours prior, was now forced to submit to the cold steel cuffs himself. Sterling ratcheted them tight, not tight enough to cut off circulation, but tight enough to let Jenkins know he was no longer the predator. He was the prey. The perp walk was legendary. Rather than sneaking Jenkins out the back door, Captain Sterling ordered him to be walked straight through the center of the bustling precinct bullpen. Dozens of officers, dispatchers, and administrative staff stopped and watched in stunned silence as the precinct's biggest bully was led out in chains by the FBI. There was no sympathy in their eyes. Jenkins had finally been exposed for the monster he was. The fallout was swift and merciless. Elias Hayes endured a grueling 6-hour surgery to repair his torn labrum and shattered joint capsule. Captain Sterling visited him every single day, bringing him meals, handling his insurance paperwork, and eventually returning the mahogany shadow box, which Sterling had personally paid a master craftsman to restore to perfection. The dashcam footage leaked to the press 3 days later. The public outcry was deafening. The city council, terrified of the optics, moved with unprecedented speed. Officer Thomas Jenkins was denied bail, deemed a flight risk and a danger to the community. Facing insurmountable evidence and the testimony of his own partner, Jenkins's high-priced defense attorney advised him to take a plea deal to avoid spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. Jenkins pled guilty to federal civil rights violations and aggravated assault. He was sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security federal prison. Because of the felony convictions, he was entirely stripped of his police pension. Officer Ryan Brody, for his cooperation, avoided federal prison time. However, he pled guilty to a misdemeanor count of failing to intervene. He was fired from the Oakwood Police Department, given 3 years of probation, and permanently decertified, meaning he could never work in law enforcement anywhere in the United States ever again. He ended up working overnight stocking shelves at a local grocery store, forever haunted by the night he chose cowardice over duty. As for Elias Hayes, he filed a massive civil rights lawsuit against the city of Oakwood. The city settled out of court for $4.5 million to avoid a catastrophic trial. True to his character, Elias didn't buy a mansion or a fleet of sports cars. He used the majority of the settlement money to establish the Oakwood Veterans Transition Center, a fully funded non-profit dedicated to helping combat veterans receive medical care, legal assistance, and psychological support. Karma had come full circle. The darkness that 2 corrupt cops tried to impose on a deserted highway had been shattered by the unwavering integrity of a captain willing to cross the thin blue line. Thomas Jenkins traded his badge for a jumpsuit, learning the hardest way possible that true power doesn't come from a gun, a badge, or the ability to inflict pain. True power comes from the truth, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried in the rain and the dark, will always find the light. The city of Oakwood had seemingly returned to normal, but beneath the surface, a venomous resentment was brewing. Thomas Jenkins was locked behind the concrete walls of a federal penitentiary, and Ryan Brody was banished from the force, but the toxic culture that had enabled them for a decade was not entirely dead. It had simply retreated into the shadows, coalescing around one man, Frank Cobb. As the president of the Oakwood Police Benevolent Association, Cobb was infuriated by Jenkins's swift and highly public downfall. It wasn't that Cobb particularly cared about Jenkins as a person. Jenkins was a brute and a liability. But to Cobb, Captain William Sterling's actions represented a catastrophic threat to the Union's absolute power. Sterling had bypassed the Union's protective red tape, worked directly with internal affairs, and invited the FBI into their house. Cobb saw this as an unforgivable betrayal of the thin blue line. He decided that Captain Sterling had to be completely destroyed to send a message to the rest of the department. Nobody crosses the Union. 6 months after the rainy night on Interstate 84, Cobb launched his counter-offensive. Using his extensive political connections and deep pockets funded by Union dues, Cobb orchestrated a relentless, coordinated smear campaign against Captain Sterling. He filed a mountain of frivolous grievances, accusing Sterling of creating a hostile work environment, bypassing due process, and harassing rank-and-file officers. Cobb found a willing ally in City Councilman Richard Belmont, a corrupt politician who relied heavily on the police union's endorsements and campaign contributions. Belmont convened a special oversight committee to investigate Sterling's leadership failures. The local newspapers, fed anonymous leaks by Cobb, began running headlines questioning Sterling's mental fitness and loyalty to his officers. The precinct morale plummeted. Good officers who respected Sterling were intimidated into silence by Cobb's cronies, threatened with the loss of backup on dangerous calls if they didn't fall in line. The final blow came on a crisp Tuesday morning. Captain Sterling was summoned to City Hall. Councilman Belmont, flanked by a smug Frank Cobb, handed Sterling an official decree. Captain Sterling, pending the results of a full disciplinary tribunal regarding your erratic conduct, you are hereby placed on indefinite unpaid administrative leave, Belmont declared, his voice dripping with bureaucratic sanctimony. Hand over your badge and your service weapon. Sterling stared at the two men. He recognized the ambush for exactly what it was. He was being pushed out, isolated, and financially bled dry by a system that preferred comfortable corruption over painful accountability. With a heavy heart, knowing that fighting this rigged committee would only bankrupt his family in legal fees, Sterling unpinned his silver oak leaves and placed his badge on the mahogany table. "You're making a grave mistake, Richard," Sterling said quietly. He turned his steely gaze to Cobb. "And you, Frank, you're defending a rot that will eventually eat you alive." Cobb just smirked, adjusting his cheap tie. "Have a nice retirement, Bill." News of Captain Sterling's suspension hit the local evening broadcast. Across town, sitting in the newly renovated office of the Oakwood Veterans Transition Center, Elias Hayes watched the television screen with a hardening jaw. Elias had spent the last 6 months turning his $4.5 million settlement into a thriving sanctuary for combat veterans. He had hired therapists, legal counselors, and career coaches. He had found a new purpose. But seeing the man who had risked his own career to save him, the man who had stood in the freezing rain and stripped a racist cop of his power, being publicly crucified, ignited a fierce, protective loyalty in Elias's chest. "They think they can just bury him," Elias muttered to himself, turning off the TV. Elias understood tactics. He understood that a frontal assault on the Union would fail. Cobb was too entrenched. If Elias was going to save Captain Sterling, he needed to flank the enemy. He needed intelligence, and he needed superior firepower. Elias picked up his phone and dialed a number he had saved months ago. It rang twice before it was answered. "Agent Miller, FBI Field Office," the voice said. "Agent Miller, it's Elias Hayes. I need your help," Elias said, his voice dropping into the same calm, hyper-focused tone he used in combat zones. "And I think we need to loop in IA Detective Lawson. Frank Cobb just made the biggest mistake of his life." Over the next 3 weeks, a secret alliance formed. Elias utilized the extensive network of his Veterans Foundation, quietly hiring 2 brilliant forensic accountants, both former military intelligence officers. Working entirely off the books, while Detective Lawson provided encrypted access to public union expenditure records and Agent Miller navigated federal banking subpoenas, they began to trace the money. What they found was staggering. Cobb wasn't just a protective union bulldog. He was a parasite. The forensic accountants uncovered a massive, sophisticated kickback scheme. For years, Cobb had been steering lucrative police union arbitration contracts and legal defense funds to a specific shell law firm, a firm that, on paper, was owned by a proxy, but in reality was controlled by Councilman Belmont. In exchange for the inflated legal fees, Belmont kicked back 20% of the profits directly into a private offshore account owned by Frank Cobb. Cobb had literally been stealing millions from the retirement pensions of the very police officers he claimed to protect, using the funds to buy political leverage to protect corrupt cops like Jenkins, which in turn generated more lawsuits and more legal fees. It was a perfect, sickening circle of corruption. Elias looked at the final dossier, neatly printed and bound. The trap was set. It was time to spring it. The City Hall chambers were packed to maximum capacity, buzzing with nervous tension. At the front of the room, Councilman Richard Belmont presided over the disciplinary committee. Captain William Sterling sat alone at the defense table, wearing a dark suit, his face carved with exhaustion from the relentless, months-long smear campaign. Frank Cobb stood at the podium, red-faced and theatrical. And therefore, Captain Sterling's blatant disregard for the collective bargaining agreement proves he is entirely unfit to wear the uniform. Cobb bellowed, slamming his fist down. "We demand his permanent termination!" A smattering of applause broke out from Cobb's loyalists. Belmont gave a solemn, rehearsed nod. "Thank you, Mr. Cobb. Captain Sterling, do you have any final words before we vote?" Sterling took a deep breath, preparing to accept his fate with quiet dignity. But before he could speak, the heavy double doors at the back of the chamber swung open with a resounding crack. Every head turned. Elias Hayes stood in the doorway. Wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase, he radiated the undeniable, grounded authority of a combat veteran. "Mr. Hayes," Belmont stammered, his gavel hovering, "this is a closed hearing. You do not have the floor." "With all due respect, Councilman," Elias's deep voice carried effortlessly across the silent room. "As a taxpayer and the direct victim of the officers who sparked this tribunal, I have a registered right to public comment. I verified it with the city clerk 10 minutes ago." Belmont scowled, looking to the city attorney, who nervously nodded. "Make it brief," Belmont sighed in defeat. Elias strode down the center aisle, bypassing the podium to stand shoulder to shoulder with Sterling at the defense table. Sterling looked up, surprise and gratitude flickering in his silver eyes. "6 months ago, I was assaulted by men who hid their cruelty behind a badge," Elias addressed the crowd. "I was saved by Captain Sterling, a man who refused to look the other way. But we are here today because Mr. Cobb claims he is the true protector of this department." Elias turned his piercing gaze to Cobb, who suddenly looked very uncomfortable. "So, my foundation looked into exactly how Mr. Cobb protects those officers." Elias unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a bound dossier. "This is a forensic accounting report. It details how Frank Cobb has systematically embezzled over $3.2 million from the Oakwood Police Union Pension Fund." The chamber erupted into absolute chaos. Gasps, shouts, and camera flashes filled the room. Off-duty officers who had previously glared at Sterling suddenly turned furious eyes toward Cobb. "That's a lie!" Cobb shrieked, his voice cracking. "The money was routed through inflated arbitration contracts." Elias raised his voice over the noise. Contracts awarded to a shell corporation wholly owned by Councilman Richard Belmont. Belmont went pale, dropping his gavel entirely. "Order!" he shouted weakly. But no one listened. Elias nodded toward the back of the room. The doors opened again. FBI Special Agent Robert Miller strode in, flanked by federal agents and Aya Detective Sarah Lawson, who held a stack of sealed warrants. "Frank Cobb and Richard Belmont," Agent Miller boomed over the chaos. "You are under arrest for federal racketeering, wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." Agents yanked Belmont from his chair, securing his wrists. Agent Miller personally walked up to Cobb, who was trembling violently, trapped by the hateful glares of the very officers whose retirement funds he had stolen. Miller slapped the heavy steel cuffs onto Cobb's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent, Frank. I highly suggest you use it." As the corrupt officials were marched out in disgrace, a stunned silence fell over the room. Elias turned to Sterling, extending his hand. Sterling stood up, a profound smile breaking across his weary face. He grasped Elias's hand, pulling him into a brief, strong embrace. "I don't know how you did it, son," Sterling whispered. "Thank you." "You covered my 6, Captain," Elias replied softly. "I always cover my brothers." The aftermath was historic. With the systemic corruption exposed, the Oakwood Police Department underwent a massive reformation. A week later, the mayor reinstated William Sterling, not as a captain, but promoting him to chief of police. Chief Sterling immediately instituted sweeping de-escalation policies and a zero-tolerance mandate for excessive force. Meanwhile, Elias Hayes expanded the Oakwood Veterans Transition Center to 3 more cities, saving countless lives. The dark night on Interstate 84 didn't break Elias or destroy Sterling. It became the lightning strike that shattered a corrupt empire, proving that when men of unyielding integrity stand shoulder to shoulder, justice always finds the light. If this incredible story of ultimate justice and hard-hitting karma got your blood pumping, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends to spread the message that corruption never wins in the end. True stories of heroes like Elias Hayes and Chief Sterling remind us that good people are still fighting for what is right. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our weekly drops of intense, real-life dramas and epic karmic comebacks. Drop a comment below and let us know what you thought of Elias's explosive courtroom twist. Thank you for watching, stay vigilant, and we will see you in the next incredible story.